Hello again, and welcome to part 4 of this 5-part series on data binding. In part 3, we talked about implementing the iNotify property change interface in our movie class to take advantage of the different kinds of data binding, the one-way, two-way, that sort of thing. And now in part 4, we're going to work on not only binding a movie object, but binding to a list of movie objects. So we're going to bind to more than one. And what we're going to need to use here is an observable collection. So we want an observable collection of movie objects. So what is an observable collection? Let's see. According to MSDN, it represents a dynamic data collection that provides notifications when items get added, removed, or when the whole list is refreshed. So dynamic data collection, kind of like your basic list. But the second and most important part there is that it provides notifications when items get added, removed, or the list is refreshed. So this sounds a lot like the iNotify property change interface that we just dealt with in the previous post, but it's more specific to making those notifications for a list, for a collection. So that's what the observable collection is. So to create that, we need to come to our shared folder, and we want to add a class, so a new item. I'll choose class, and I'm going to call this movies data source. And now that it's popped up, I've actually got some code I'm going to copy in there as usual, and I'll talk about what I'm doing. So, movies data source, it says that it's inheriting from observable collection of movie objects, and I need to resolve that. Alright, so now our errors go away. So all we're doing in the constructor here is we're calling load data, and this load data, we're just adding movie objects to our observable collection of movie objects. So fairly simple. I've got X-Men, Divergent, Draft Day, Rio 2, and Blended. 5 different movies that we've added, and these are the 5 movies that we want to display in our UI. So to display a list of movies, we needed to change the UI a little bit, and I've already made those changes. And to do this, scroll up a little bit, I've just included a list view, and list views are controls for displaying a list of things. I've given it a name called list view, and then it's got an item template defined as a static resource about what each item in this list view will look like. And let's go to the definition of that template. Here it is here, the data template. And all it has, just like we did back in part 2, it has a stack panel of 3 text blocks, one for title, one for rating, and one for year. So we're going to have a list of items, and each item has those 3 text blocks to display all of our information. And now the last thing we need to do to make this happen is, instead of binding or setting the data context of our page to a movie instance, we need to set the item source property, and I'll define that in a second, of our list view to an instance of our movies data source class, which is an observable collection of movie objects. It's kind of confusing, but let's go ahead and make those changes. So instead of this movie, I want to have movies data source, and I'll call it movies. And then again, I want to initialize it here, new data source. So we're just initializing it. We don't have to do these individual properties because it's taken care of for us in the movies data source. They've already set those things for us. And this is called from the constructor. So then the last thing we need to do is we need to say list view dot item source equals movies. And again, we're using the list view because it's a control that's able to display a list of information. And then its item source property is almost the same as the data context, but item source is used for a collection or a list of things. So that way we know that we're binding to a list of movie objects and actually binding to an instance of our movies data source object. So let's run this in Windows 8 on our local machine again and see how our project has changed. Alright, now we can see the list of those 5 movies that we defined in our movies data source. Right? So again, what we did, we changed our UI to have a list view instead of just 3 different text blocks. So we have a list view that displays a list of movies, and those movies are defined in our movies data source class, which is an observable collection. Hopefully that makes sense. That ends part 4. In part 5, we're going to do a very similar thing, but instead of using this static data that I've just hard-coded here, we're going to actually load some data from the Rotten Tomatoes API. So stay tuned for part 5.